You Can't Be Too Careful Anymore, Chapter 2 by rufeepeach, and congrats on the wedding, guys! Rumpelstiltskin awoke on the floor of his dining room, scorched and aching, but alive. Belle was nowhere to be seen. The curtains, however, were a mess of ashes and little bits of ruined cloth. Well, he had never known his little housekeeper could do that. She was lucky he was the Dark One. Anyone else might have had a little more permanent damage done to them. But he could be a phoenix when he wanted to be, and there was barely even any pain now. He stood, brushed the last of his own dust off his coat, and set about finding his housekeeper. The Queen's guards, stationed in his hallway, stopped him in his tracks. She wouldn't send in her people if she knew he still breathed. It was a relief, knowing she thought him so easily dealt with. One more person who knew nothing of the knife. Still, there were people with swords in his hallway, and that was not an acceptable state of affairs. They didn't even see him, for the cloud of purple magic surrounded them both, and they were being crushed under Rumpelstiltskin's boot. Snails were a nice classic, but cockroaches made a far more satisfying little crunch underfoot. It was sweet that the Queen believed that her guards would stop anyone. If they couldn't catch even one rogue princess, what kind of chance did they believe they had against the Dark One, or anyone brave enough to seek out his home? She must believe him dead and gone if she'd left her men behind to claim his castle. She'd already claimed something else of his. He'd been promised forever with his little maid, and there was something of a mess that needed cleaning up. True, maid didn't really fit the role she would have to take upon her return if he intended to have any upholstery left at all, but it would do for now. Good help was so hard to find. He tried to lose the memory he had of her just before the flames started, the one of a soft and startled woman in his arms, staring at him and blushing. He'd never seen her so much as spark before. What did it mean that the first time his arms were around her, she started a blazing inferno? That she needed help, obviously. He shook his head, clearing all other thoughts from his mind. This was no different than if Regina had decided to steal his spinning wheel or a roll of golden thread. No one stole what was rightfully his. Or at least, when they did, they didn't keep it for long. He couldn't have been out longer than a few hours, surely, although, truth be told, this had never happened before. He hoped that she wouldn't have gotten too comfortable with Belle, wouldn't have thrown up any new defenses yet, especially if she'd seen what, to all intents and purposes, had been his mangled remains before the dark magic had time to do its work. The idea of what Regina could come up with to hurt his maid turned his stomach. The Queen had no compassion, no empathy, and certainly no mercy. She would know what Belle could do simply from the wreckage left behind, and most likely guess the rest. Belle could be treated as the princess who slew the beast, or as a plaything, a pet, a slave locked in the dungeon. But either way, Rumpelstiltskin had little time to lose. With a twist of his thoughts, the castle melted down around him, and he was 300 miles south and west of the dark castle outside the Queen's fortress. More cockroaches were left in his wake. He wasn't one to sneak in the back, especially when he had planned to stage a daring rescue. Anyone who worked for the Queen, who bore arms and was willing to slaughter the innocent in her name and wear those ridiculous costumes while they were at it, was better off as a cockroach. At least insects had a little dignity. He could sense Belle before he saw her, and he wondered how had he ever missed the unmistakable pulse of magic coming from her, the little shining beacon she became. If only one were paying attention. He cursed his own stupidity. The Queen had noticed what he had overlooked, and this was the price he paid for being so blind. The power was pulsing, once more wild and uncontrolled, and growing ever worse. He considered simply leaving his little bonfire to it. She obviously didn't harm herself with these outbursts, and if left to her own devices, it was possible she could bring down this entire stinking castle, murder the Queen before she had a chance to do any more harm, and have her staff with her. It was a tempting thought. But Belle was not a dark creature. no matter how threatening the strength of her powers, and she wouldn't want that. The idea of blood staining her delicate little hands was appalling to him. If any killing were to take place, it would have to be by his hand, his magic. She was in the tallest tower and terrified, and yet the flames did not begin. Perhaps the queen had sealed her in a ball of power, leaving his Belle trapped by her own flames. While they could not truly harm her, he could not imagine that such a situation could be pleasant. He saw a cleric run down the stairs as he stalked upward. He took one look at Rumpelstiltskin's gnarled and furious face and muttered a quick prayer, made his holy symbols, and fled. She had summoned the priests, and now Rumpelstiltskin was afraid. The clerics of this land were not the good and holy men they were in other realms, for the presence of two sources of dark magic corrupted everyone in some way. They were self-righteous and wicked, corrupt, and intent upon their own ends. They burnt healers at the stake and terrified villages with talk of monsters hiding in innocently spirited young girls. If the queen had brought them in for Belle, then things were worse than he had feared. If he found that one hair on her head was out of place, Regina would wish that she had died with her stable boy. He slipped inside the tower room, quiet as a ghost, and stopped dead in his tracks. His Belle hung from the wall, head hung, her hair tangled around her face, stripped to her thin shift and trembling. There were little red lines whittling every inch of her exposed skin. A little trickle of blood dried on her cheek. Regina smirked her thick, bloody smile as a cleric's knife left Belle's pale flesh and left a thin band of blood in its wake. How long had he been out, reforming himself from his own ashes for this to happen? How long had she languished in this tower, waiting for him to rescue her? A burst of fire came from her fingertips as the knife left her, a jagged cry drawn from her lips, and Regina nodded, smiling in satisfaction. The doors burst open and shattered into a shower of splinters. The queen spun to see him lounging in the doorway, cruel smirk masking a raging, icy kind of anger. The kind that came right before the Dark One emerged from behind Rumpelstiltskin's face and wreaked merry havoc on the world. The shock on her face was priceless. "You've stolen something that belongs to me," he said, and his grit teeth, the tension in every muscle of his body, belied his casual tone. He wanted to tear and rip and gouge, to tie bows in her blood vessels and trace pretty patterns into bare muscle, to carve statues from her bones and hack at her flesh. Belle whimpered, and another pulse of power threatened the magic walls placed around her, sending a shower of sparks across the previously invisible surface. Very neat. Very gone. With a breath of magic and a snarling grin, the bonds around Belle, both physical, chaining his girl to the wall, and Regina would pay for that as well, and magical, broke into a million sharp and flying pieces. He caught her as she fell, across the room in an instant, arms back around her, holding her up. She was staring at him in horror, and for a moment he was worried he'd done wrong. Perhaps she saw this as a better alternative to his castle, but her horror was blank, a fear of everyone and everything, impersonal and all-consuming, and he relaxed. She was shaking, trembling, terrified. Her eyes looked down, saw the arm around her, and followed it up to his face. Her terror was worse now because it wasn't for herself. She'd killed him the last time his hands were on her, and she wouldn't forget that in a hurry. That anyone feared for his safety was laughable. If she wanted to worry, she should save it for someone who needed it. Regina's guards were crawling, scratching insects. Her clerics simply turned to dust. Rumpelstiltskin barely remembered doing it, so consumed was he by keeping Belle from bursting, keeping her skin tight over her bones and her power concealed within. Regina stood alone, facing him, and she seemed so angry that fear was an afterthought. "How are you still alive?" she ground out. "I have a bottle of your ashes as proof." "Of what, dear?" he asked, trying to keep his own temper level. No need to upset Belle any further. He could deal with Regina later. That I decided a new skin would do quite nicely? Are you really so ignorant as to believe that a simple fire could destroy me? She is a demon child. The Queen nodded to Belle, smiling, regaining her equilibrium. I don't know what you have done to her, Rumple, but it's rather impressive. She's such a pretty little disaster. She leaned forward to pinch Belle's chin, a parody of affection, and he was so proud of his girl when she jerked her head away and glared. Regina was wrapped in chains before she even knew it, choking and gasping for breath. He spun his finger, just one finger, around and around, binding her in coils of thick iron and hauling her to him with one crooked knuckle. Now, dearie, no need for insults, he hissed right into her face and cast her backwards. She hit the wall with a groan, unable to move or hardly breathe with the metal crushing her body. He hoped something was broken. He hoped she was in agony. He could kill her here and now for what she'd done to his Belle. But who knew when another soul as dark and desperate as she would come along? He needed her, alive and brooding and plotting downfalls, and if her knowing he could not die would keep her from trying while she went about becoming the curse-caster he needed her to be, well, then so be it. She had obviously thought herself his equal because he'd never come for her before. She'd never taken something he truly valued before either. That she still breathed was because of his need for her agony to grow, not because of any inability he had to simply slit her throat while she slept. There must be one servant around here who isn't currently on 6 legs, he chortled. Let's hope they find you soon, dearie. Then they were gone in a cloud of noxious purple smoke, Regina coughing and writhing in her bonds. He laid his Belle in her bed in the castle, in the room prepared for her for when he'd get up the nerve to tell her she could leave the dungeons, settling her and trying to be soothing, stroking her hair. How did... She started, but he pressed a gentle finger to her lips and shushed her. His other hand went to her forehead and rested there, trying to be calming, drawing the tension and burning magic from her little by little. I'm the one person in this whole world you cannot harm, Belle, he murmured, and her eyes widened. Luckily enough. He looked up and down her body, covered in only her thin cotton underdress, and the cuts and bruises she had were enough to turn his stomach. But they would be treatable. With a little time and care, her black eye and split lip would heal soon enough. Her right arm, however, made him murderous. Someone had carved demon whore into the soft skin of her forearm with deep and jagged strokes. That she was still alive after such treatment was simply remarkable. The clerics, she whispered, trying to draw the demon out. She was shaking, tears rolling down her bruised cheeks, and he tried to brush them all away with his thumbs, but he could not catch them all. I killed you, she sobbed. You failed, dearie. Unkillable. He smiled, tried to look proud and happy for her. See? He gestured to his unscathed body, but she did not smile back. I'll be gone by morning, she promised, nodding, still trembling, her tears falling hot and fast down her cheeks. I won't trouble you again. My demon is mine, and it won't ever harm you again, I swear. That brought him up short, and he shook his head hard, banished such a foolish idea with a flick of his wrist. You shall do no such thing. You promised forever, dearie, and that's what I shall have. My demon is a foolish fantasy dreamt up by a twisted soul intent on scaring young women, he snapped, and she flinched. Good, she needed that. It was a ridiculous notion that her power could even be remotely demonic. She was just a child, really, a girl with wide and innocent eyes. Demons came from selfish, cruel, and twisted acts. Demons came from murderers. Regina murdered her mother, and her goodness died then and there, leaving only a painful and empty blackness. 3 centuries passed. He himself had stabbed an ancient sorcerer in a forest, and so his skin was forever tainted. The only way to become a demon, to allow it to rest in your heart and suckle your soul, was to kill someone just as dark and inherit it. Belle was a firestarter, yes, but that did not make her in any way demonic, and to tell her anything else was evil of the highest form. "It will kill anyone it touches," she whimpered, pleading, and how long had she lived with this terrible lie? "It is a power, Belle," he said, "a gift, to use as you will." He smiled. "But gone for now." His palm left her forehead, and a small vial appeared in his hand, glowing a predictable red gold. "This," he murmured, "is today's power. Gone. You can rest without any fear of explosions, and I will do the same every day until you're ready." "My power?" she asked, her voice low and tired. "Gone?" "Yes," he confirmed. "Gone. For now. It will be fully restored by the time the sun sets tomorrow." "You could do that forever." She nodded. My demon could leave." "No." He shook his head. "You have to learn. You could be a powerful sorceress, dearie, if you just learnt to control your powers rather than hide from them." She was trembling again, horrified and terror-struck, but nothing caught fire. "Not me," she begged. "No, not me." "Sleep," he urged, stroking her hair, sending a stream of soothing magic through her to take the pain from her wounds. "We will discuss it in the morning." And then he was gone, and she was alone in her room. He watched her through a mirror. The queen was bound in her own tower. There was no need to avoid them just now. As she thrashed for a moment, a lifetime of pent-up energy released for the first time without fear. Then lay still and drifted into unconsciousness. She could no longer serve as a maid, he decided, but then, he'd no real need of one, did he? Far better to have an apprentice. She was certainly bright enough, naturally powerful, and trustworthy in a way he'd found was horribly rare. He could teach her to control her powers, teach her to turn the power toward good in a way his personal demon never could. "Thank you,"